kind of becomes the question. How am I going to use what God has given to me? And I think you're right in the point that's being made here is serving others. Now, again, there's not a lot of that in that parable, I'd admit. Because, again, that parable was just about seeking those higher seats, exalting yourself, thinking that you're more important than others. I had James chapter 4, verse 10. James 4, verse 10 just says, humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. But again, what's that humbling of yourself, I think, is yielding to him, submitting to him, doing what he wants you to do instead of what you want to do. Who's in charge of my life? Not me. God is. He's the one that's calling the shots. He's, got to look out for number one. Yes, you do. Just don't forget who number one is. It is not you. You aren't number one. He is number one. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah. 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 Great pneumatic device. Yeah, I've seen that used before. If you can just remember joy. Jesus, then others, then yourself. Keep those things in the right order. And I think that's a great point. Great illustration. And then the other passage that I had related to this parable in Luke chapter 14, verse 7 through 11, is in 1 Peter 5, verse 5 and 6, which, again, in the context, it says, you younger men, likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time. What's kind of interesting is, kind of blends these two together. He's talking about our relationships with one another, and he does talk about this idea of submitting and yielding, and he does it with younger men, submitting or yielding to their elders, allow their rulership. That's hard for young men. Young men are very opinionated, as are older men too, and young women and older women too, and pretty much all human beings. But to yield to somebody else's authority, to yield to somebody else's direction. Children struggle with that with their parents. We have to be taught that early on. Your parents do know better than you. And even if they don't, they're your parents, so yield to them. Your elders know better than you. Even if they don't, they're your elders, so yield to them. Again, we always have to put the caveat in there, unless they're making you do something that would violate God's will. Of course, we always understand that. God's will would come first. If somebody, an elder, a parent, I don't care who they are, is telling you to do something that would not be pleasing to God, you don't do it. We all understand that. But outside of that parameter, so he first says, kind of yield, and then he does that in this idea of humbling yourself. And then humble to each other in all of these things. Considering everybody else is more important than me. All of their needs I'm going to consider, before my own needs. And then he connects that to humbling yourself to God, yielding yourself to God. Larry? Absolutely. I think that's probably an area where maybe more than anything else we could stand out in the world. And in some ways, get some positive attention, because again, they're supposed to see our light shine in such a way that it is going to attract them, and then they'll end up glorifying God, because it's not about glorifying us. It's not that, hey, I'm such a great example, so there's going to be a Jason fan club out there somewhere that's praising me, and that's what I'm supposed to be doing. But this idea of sacrifice and humility runs so contrary to everything around us in this world that I think people really do notice that. When somebody is truly selfless, when somebody is truly just putting the interests of others, and there's nothing they're going to get back from it. They're not playing politics. They're not, networking in some way. I'm not saying networking is necessarily bad or politics is necessarily bad in certain contexts. But, this idea of just serving, just giving, and there's really nothing that you're going to get back, I think people in the world would notice that. And then that does open a door for them to come and say, why? Why would you do that? I don't understand. That's a great point. Any other comments on that? And again, I wouldn't want to use any of those things to to kind of toot your own horn, the one area in our life where we've had more opportunities to talk to people about God and how he makes people and his love has been Jonathan, especially in the early years. We did have people ask, why would you adopt a child like that when he was so weak and sickly? And, you say, well, I mean, he's made in the image of God. You talk about the value that God places on life. And because they were just thinking from a human perspective. I had people tell me, he's probably not going to contribute much to society. You're probably going to have to take care of him his whole life. He's probably never going to, well, so what? I mean, it's that you're just looking at what you're going to get out of somebody, what they're going to give you in that relationship or provide for you when you can send them off. That's not what God's called us to do. So, Shirley? Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, I think the fact that in our culture as a whole, we've lost so much of reflecting the love of God, I think that's manifested pretty easily in the division that we see and the problems that we see, and that's part of why they're there, because people aren't reflecting the love of God, of just understanding. He loves us. He considers each one of value. All men were created equal. I mean, in the founding documents of this nation, was the idea God made us all equal. God granted to us all of these things. As you've removed that part from it, that's where we have all of a sudden gotten all these fightings. And in the earlier days of the country, even though there were huge problems, when they were operating on that principle, it kept fixing things. The longer you reflected on the way God made it, the more you corrected the problems that were there. Then you throw God out, and there's no correcting the problems. But it's a good point. Any other comments on that? Anything from that first parable? Again, we're doing two parables together, and the second one has a little bit more meat insofar as the story is concerned. So if there's nothing else on that, the idea of taking the chief seats from Luke 14, verses 7 through 11, let's go on and jump over to Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Again, it's not a lengthy passage. It is a parable, again, that we're probably familiar with. It does come right after a parable on prayer that we already looked at, the unrighteous judge. We studied that a couple of lessons back in this idea of prayer. So Luke chapter 18 had begun with, he was telling them a parable to show them at all times how to pray and not lose heart. And so he told that parable. But then right after that parable, beginning in verse 9, it says, and he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, when we get to that last verse, we see very strongly the connection between the last parable that we looked at and this one. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. Everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. But we're given this parable where once again, there's not a lot of details that you have to kind of go through. This represents this and this represents that. It's not a parable in that sense, like when we had the parable of the sower, the parable of the tares. This represents the word of God. This represents the world. This represents the kingdom. We don't have any of those elements. What we have is two different attitudes that are being displayed. As Jesus is trying to get us to see what the difference is here between this humbling of ourselves and exalting of ourselves. And, verse 9, I think, is very significant when he says he told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. There's your context. Now, who the some people are, he didn't really identify, which is a little unusual. We might think, who you might think of, you might think, the example in the story is a Pharisee who went off, and the Pharisees, Luke isn't afraid to just tell us, Jesus was saying this about the Pharisees on some occasions. He's teaching this about the Pharisees. He's teaching this about the leaders of the Jews. He's teaching this about their scribes. Here it just says some of them. He doesn't really identify. That there were some people, but who are these people? They're people who trust in themselves that they were righteous. That's half of the equation. They trust in themselves that they're right. They feel very secure in their righteousness. I'm in a right relationship with God. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm the great example. I am that light and I'm that salt. Let me tell you how good I am and what I'm doing. That's part of it. But he also adds, and they viewed others with contempt. I'm really good and they really aren't. I'm really everything that I should be, and these other people are not the kind of people that they should be. Now that's a context. Any thought on that before we get into the prayer itself? You know anybody like that? Certainly not us. We're not like that type of people. Other people are, right? It was been talking about the parables. It's so easy to apply that to other people and not us. George?
Often we see this professional, in whatever professional walk you might be in. You always have those who have the knowledge and those who might not have as much. And how quick we are to exalt ourselves in that regard and look down on those others. It stands in everyone's life.
It does. It does. It can be in almost anything that we do. And again, as we've looked at a lot of these parables, we have a tendency, and probably even in my preaching, without noticing it, we end up saying, we're trying to do this, and all those people out there. I always go this way because the street's out there. I don't go this way because the annex with the classrooms is over there. So, those people, they don't care about God. Those people that are out there driving by today instead of being in a church service, those people that went to a bar last night, those people that did, they're the bad people. We're the good people. This parable is directly to that kind of thinking. And I kind of wonder, he taught this parable to some people. Instead of identifying another group, is that left so that we would make more of an application to ourselves if it applies to ourselves? That view ourselves this way as opposed to others? And then when you get to this prayer, the two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other the tax collector. And Jesus is purposely using, he's using two categories of Jews. So they're going to be God's people. They're part of that covenant. But he did try to, he chose a Pharisee that was considered by the people in Jesus' day the most religious, the most righteous, the most dedicated. The Pharisees among the people, were the holiest. That's how they viewed them. And the tax collector, who would be viewed at the lowest end of this spectrum. The tax collectors, again, are cheats. They're liars. They're swindlers. They've sold themselves out to the Romans. There's all these reasons to not like them. They're not really. Pharisees, a Jew of Jews. A tax collector is probably, they probably call him a Gino, a Jew in name only. We use those political terms, but he's not really living like a Jew. Shirley? Yeah. Yeah. Not entirely sure what, and that certainly does sound bad, and it may mean that. In the Greek text there, that's how it's worded. Some have suggested it might just mean he was praying silently, which would take a little bit of but I'm not sure. I think maybe that's meant to be there like that. I mean, he is kind of praying to himself. Standing by himself praying. Yeah, there's a little bit of interpretation on that as to what's going on. There's also sometimes been a big deal made about, the Pharisee's standing, and he stood, or maybe standing by himself or praying to himself. And there does seem to be this very kind of bold, coming before God, and whether he's praying to himself or praying silently, praying to God, God, I thank you, I am not like other people. You know, that kind of a prayer. I thank you I'm not like swindlers and the unjust and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. When he first comes, I'm so thankful I'm not like other people. I'm so thankful I'm one of your people. I'm one of yours and not one of them. And even uses that tax collector as the example. And then he goes on to say what he does. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. And so he comments on his own devotion to God. And that's what his prayer is like. I know we'll have some comments about that. But, well, yeah, let's take any comments about that prayer? Yes, sir. Okay, great point. And we do sometimes, I mean, we can come across that way. Maybe some of us have done that before, presenting ourselves in that way instead of presenting ourselves humbly. When we're wanting to share the gospel with other people, one of the things we keep a couple things in mind. I mean, we're not the ones who are saving them. God is. The gospel message is what we're saying. We're just trying to help as we've been helped. Someone else had to help us. And we're turning around and sharing that message with others. Not that we're experts on it, not that we're doing everything perfectly. And so that's a good point that you bring in there. You know, have you ever wondered where somebody would get a prayer like this from? I mean, it sounds pretty arrogant. It sounds pretty bold. One of the things that I do want to bring out is there's actually a passage in the Old Testament that sounds a little bit like this. And it doesn't it's not brought out very often. In fact, I didn't know, I'd kind of looked over it before. Doy Moyer, a number of years ago, shared this with me. We were talking about this passage, and he said, well, you know, that Pharisee's prayer isn't just totally out of left field. What that Pharisee is saying, I mean, he's trying to tell God, I've done what you told me to do. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I have. And then there is this little bit, you know, I'm your people. I'm not like other people. I want to read a little bit to you from Deuteronomy 26, and I just want you to think of how somebody could take a passage like this and use it to kind of defend that kind of prayer. Deuteronomy 26, beginning in verse 12, and it's in a specific context of, you know, when they do these things and keeping the law. But Deuteronomy 26, beginning in verse 12, when you have finished paying all the tithe of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, you shall give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. Then verse 13 says, you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion from my house, and also have given it to the Levite and the alien, the orphan and the widow, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed or forgotten any of your commandments. I have not eaten of it while mourning, nor have I removed any of it while I was unclean, nor offered any of it to the dead. I have listened to the voice of the Lord my God. I have done according to all you have commanded me. Look down from your holy habitation from heaven and bless your people Israel and the ground which you have given us, a land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our fathers. This day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and ordinances. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart, with all your soul. You have today declared to the Lord your God that you would walk in his ways and keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and listen to his voice. The Lord has today declared you to be his people, a treasured possession, as he promised you that you should keep all his commandments, and that he will set you high above all nations which he has made, for praise, fame, and honor, that you should be a consecrated people to the Lord your God, as he has spoken. I'm not going to defend the Pharisee. The Pharisee is wrong. But can you see how a Pharisee could take a passage like that says, when you've done what God told you to do, I want you to tell God, I've done what you told me to do. I have kept all of your commandments. I have paid the tithe. I have fasted. And I am a consecrated person to you. We are a holy people. We are not like other people. We are your people. I just want you to see, I think it's perverted a little bit, but you can see where some of that might come from, George.
Yeah, well, I think where the perversion comes in is where he draws comparison.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's the real problem here? Well, what does Jesus say at the beginning? He's telling them a parable because some people are trusting themselves in their righteousness and despising others. And that's where this really kind of got off. There's not a problem with fasting twice a week, is there? God's not mad because the Pharisees fasting twice a week. God's not mad because the Pharisees tithing of everything that he has. What there's this self-righteousness, self-trusting, but also this despising of other people. And that's what kind of came in here. There is a sense in which Israel was a special people, right? They're God's consecrated people. They're God's, what were they supposed to do with that? Be a light to the Gentiles? Help pull them toward God? Was that typically the Jewish viewpoint on that? You know, we're God's special people. We have this special relationship. We're the only ones who, I mean, we're the only ones going to heaven. You know, we're the one true Israel. We're the one true church. You know, we're the only ones that have the right religion in the whole world. You had this little group of people, Israel. They're the only ones with the right religion. Everybody else is worshiping idols. Everybody else is involved in some sort of, you know, the parallel here is, I hope you're seeing the parallel, right? Do I have to spell that out more? We're the only true church. Everybody else is in the denominational world. We're the only ones who are worshiping properly. They're all worshiping incorrectly. We're the only ones who really understand this relationship with God. That was true in the Old Testament with Israel. How did they use it? How were they supposed to use it? They were supposed to use it to draw others to God. They used it to just exclude everybody else and just think of themselves as this little group that's special to the Lord. Did you have a comment? Yep. Yep.
It wasn't the fact that they didn't understand it. The times they wavered was because they didn't want to.
Good point there. They never really acted like God's people, you know, and how they wavered back and forth and how they engaged in all of that idolatry. And they wanted to be like the nations around them. They didn't want to be that special people. So that's another area in which they failed in that. They never really acted like God's people, not as a whole. There was always a faithful remnant. There were a few that recognized that, were doing what they were supposed to do. Good comment. Other comments on that? You know, but again, as you kind of drive that home, if we were to talk about what people know about the Lord's church, I mean, I think I've said before, when I've talked to people in other contexts, and, you know, they'll find out that I am a member of the Church of Christ and I preach for a Church of Christ, there's usually two things that come out. What do you guess those two things are? What? That's usually the second one. They're usually kind enough to do that second. What's the other thing they know? You guys don't use musical instruments in worship. You guys don't have a piano and organ, right? And you guys think you're the only ones going to heaven. Those are the two things that pop up. Now, I mean, you could get something on baptism on there. I don't even get that very often. I don't get water baptism. I mean, that would be a distinguishing characteristic compared to so many places. But the two things that usually come up first are, oh, you guys don't use it. Well, what they usually say, you guys don't believe in music. I'm like, I believe in music. Music exists. I have no problem with a belief in music. We don't use mechanical instruments in our worship, but, you know, I do believe in music. But then you guys think you're the only ones going to heaven. And you know, that's kind of the comparison made there. Well, I think one of the things to look here, are we trusting in our own righteousness? Are we trusting in ourselves? The other part of this, are you despising others? So when you get into the second part of this parable, verse 13, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Now, again, I know sometimes a point's been made there. We also have something in Greek that you could make too much out of, but I don't know. I think it's meant to be there. he actually doesn't say, God be merciful to me, a sinner. He actually does go out of his way in the construction of that sentence to say, I am the sinner, which may be putting himself even at, like Paul would say, I'm the chief of all sinners. I'm the worst that could have been there. That in his attitude toward God, he doesn't feel like he can go up and just stand right there in the presence of God in the temple and kind of in a self-righteous way, lift his eyes to, and God, I thank you. I'm not like other people. I do such a good job of keeping your commandments. I've followed everything that you've said. I'm not like other men. Instead, he stands a distance off. He can't even lift his eyes up to heaven. He's beating his own breast, and he's just begging that God will be merciful to him. There's no way he's going to stand before God righteous on his own. It's only by God's mercy that he'll be there. Thoughts or comments on that being used in comparison? Of course, the statement that's made when Jesus goes on from this and says, I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Yeah.
This is an inclination of remorse on the person's part of repentance. If he goes off the way and serves the Lord after this, it should be mercy that God has on this time. And it's really what Jesus came for.
Yeah. Again, and this man has, this sinner, he has gone up to he's approached God. It's not defending somebody just being out there in the world doing, again, this person, but he's come with this attitude of repentance, contrition. God, please be merciful to me. And that's what Jesus came to bring, was mercy to us. Julie?
When I look at this, it makes me thankful I'm not the judge of other people. But I think that's part of the looking like we think we're the only ones who are going to heaven. I think that comes with a judgmental side of people feeling judged by us of their actions. And just kind of, in a humble way, remembering that it's not our job to decide who's going to heaven and who's not, because we don't know their hearts.
Right.
And we don't know their conversations with God. And I think it's kind of a reminder in that we're not God.
Right.
We're just here to show the world.
Absolutely. I think we've commented before that, even the conversion process, the idea of becoming a Christian is meant to be a humbling experience. You have to be humble to do it. You have to acknowledge, your sins, your shortcomings. You have to acknowledge your faith in Jesus, even baptism, that death and burial and resurrection. All of that's laying it on God. God is the only one who can take care of this. And there really has to be that recognition to even become a child of God. That, I'm asking for God's mercy. I haven't done anything to deserve this. I haven't earned this righteousness, this justification. And so that's how we become a Christian. We certainly need to make sure we keep that. I mean, yes, we should strive to continue to be better. We should strive to, be able to, on certain things, say, yes, God, I am trying to do what you've told me to do. I do listen to your commandments. I do attempt to put them into practice in my life. Not that I've been perfected there, and I'm not going to put my confidence in my own righteousness, but in yours. But we have to keep that humility. Good point. Any other comments there? What time are we supposed to wrap this up? A few minutes ago? 15 after? We're past time. Okay. Yes, sir. One final comment. Yeah.
In this process of teaching us an individual about Jesus, the first thing we have to establish Jesus' authority.
Yes. All authority.
And once you can give them to understand the authority of Jesus and God, then the rest of it will flow into place.
That's right. That's right. And that's even in Peter's Pentecost sermon when he comes to God has made him both Lord and Christ. And that's in a very succinct way acknowledging his authority. This Jesus who you crucified, God has made him Lord. He's Lord over all. He has all authority. He is Christ. He is the Savior. but he's the one with the authority. And we're going to have to yield to that. We're going to have to submit. That's what humility is about, humbling ourselves before him. Great point. Appreciate your comments very much. We will leave off there. The next worksheet, the next handout, as I told you, is there on the table, lesson number 11. And we're going to be looking at all things are ready, are used. So some of the parables of preparation and readiness. Appreciate your comments.